Born on February 25, 1943, George grew up in a modest working-class family in Liverpool, England. Life wasn't glamorous. His father drove a bus, and his mother worked in a shop before becoming a homemaker. Money was limited, but George found something that made him feel rich in possibility: music. As a teenager, he became fascinated by the guitar. While many of his friends spent their free time doing other things, George practiced for hours, carefully learning new chords and copying the styles of his favorite rock and roll artists. His dedication soon caught the attention of another young musician, Paul McCartney. The two boys attended the same school, and Paul was impressed by George's skill. Even though George was younger than the rest of the group, Paul eventually introduced him to John Lennon, who was leading a local band called the Quarrymen. At first, John wasn't convinced. George looked too young. But then George played an impressive guitar solo during an informal audition on the upper deck of a bus. His talent spoke louder than his age, and before long, he became part of the group that would eventually evolve into the Beatles. It was the beginning of a journey that would change music forever. As the band's popularity exploded in the early 1960s, Beatlemania swept across the world. Crowds screamed at airports. Concert halls filled within minutes. Fans waited for hours just to catch a glimpse of the four young musicians from Liverpool. George was living a dream. George Harrison was known as the quiet Beatle, the calm, thoughtful musician who rarely showed anger in public. But there was one person who reportedly pushed him further than almost anyone else. Behind the music, the fame, and the smiles was a relationship filled with frustration, creative clashes, and emotional wounds that lasted for years. What caused George Harrison to feel such deep resentment? The answer reveals a side of the Beatles that most fans never truly saw. Before George Harrison became one of the most famous musicians in history, he was simply a teenager from Liverpool with a guitar, a dream, and an incredible determination to improve. No one could have imagined that this quiet young boy would one day help change popular music forever. Yet even during those exciting years, there were signs that he often felt different from the others. John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the band's primary songwriters. Most of the albums featured their compositions, while George had fewer opportunities to contribute his own music. Although he respected both men, it wasn't always easy watching his songs receive less attention. Still, he continued working. He quietly improved as a songwriter, guitarist, and musician, never giving up on the hope that one day his voice would be heard just as clearly. Those who knew George often described him as thoughtful, private, and deeply interested in ideas beyond fame. While the world focused on celebrity and success, he was already beginning to explore spirituality, personal growth, and the search for deeper meaning. Before we go further, think about this. If you worked hard but constantly stood in the shadow of others, would you keep fighting to prove yourself, or would you walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments. To millions of fans, the Beatles looked like four friends living the perfect life. But behind the unforgettable songs and worldwide fame, quiet frustrations were beginning to grow. And those frustrations would eventually change the future of the greatest band in music history. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles had become more than a band. They were a global phenomenon. Every new song became a hit. Every public appearance made headlines. Fans around the world adored John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. From the outside, it looked like a dream. But inside the band, the pressure was growing. George Harrison was changing, not just as a guitarist, but as a songwriter. He was writing stronger, more personal music, and wanted his work to receive the same attention as the songs written by Lennon and McCartney. That didn't always happen. John and Paul had been writing together long before the Beatles became famous. Their songwriting partnership was one of the strongest in music history, and naturally, most albums centered around their work. George often had to fight for space. Sometimes he was allowed only one or two songs on an album, even when he believed he had written more that deserved to be included. The disappointment built slowly. Then came songs like Taxman, Within You Without You, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and Something. These tracks showed the world that George Harrison wasn't just the band's lead guitarist. He had become one of its finest songwriters. Even so, the creative balance inside the group remained difficult. As recording sessions became more intense, disagreements happened more often. Band members argued over arrangements, studio time, and the direction of new albums. George, who had once been happy simply to be part of the band, was becoming frustrated by feeling unheard. Around the same time, another important change was taking place. George became deeply interested in Indian music and spirituality. He studied the sitar under Ravi Shankar and embraced meditation and Eastern philosophy. While the other Beatles also explored these ideas, George's commitment was especially deep. His priorities were beginning to shift. Fame no longer excited him the way it once had. He wanted peace. He wanted creative freedom. And above all, he wanted respect for his own musical voice. The tension reached one of its most memorable moments during the Get Back sessions in January 1969. Cameras captured real disagreements between George and Paul McCartney over how a guitar part should be played. One exchange became famous because it revealed how strained things had become. After Paul offered repeated instructions, George calmly replied, "I'll play whatever you wanted to play," or "I won't play at all." The words weren't shouted. They were quiet, but they revealed years of built-up frustration. Soon afterward, George temporarily left the band, telling the others he was quitting. Although he returned after meetings and discussions, it was clear that the relationships inside the Beatles had changed. If you enjoy discovering the hidden stories behind music's greatest legends, subscribe now. The next chapter uncovers the documented conflicts that fueled one of the most talked-about relationships in Beatles history and separates the facts from the myths. The world still saw for smiling musicians making history. Behind the studio doors, however, years of silence were finally turning into open conflict, and what happened next would push those relationships closer to the breaking point than ever before. The internet is full of dramatic headlines. George Harrison hated him. They couldn't even be in the same room. He was George's greatest enemy. These stories attract millions of views. But what does history actually tell us? When people discuss George Harrison's biggest conflicts, one name appears more than any other: Paul McCartney. That may surprise many fans. After all, Paul introduced George to the band. They grew up in Liverpool, shared unforgettable success, and created some of the greatest music ever recorded. So what went wrong? The answer wasn't built on one argument. It was years of small frustrations that slowly became impossible to ignore. As George matured as a songwriter, he wanted his ideas to receive the same respect as those of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But during many recording sessions, Paul, known for his perfectionism, often took charge. He would suggest changes, repeat instructions, and carefully shape every detail of the song. Many musicians admired Paul for this. George often found it exhausting. This wasn't simply about ego. It was about feeling heard. The tension became visible during the Get Back recording sessions. Filmed in January 1969, cameras captured several uncomfortable moments between George and Paul. In one famous exchange, Paul tried to explain how he imagined a guitar part should sound. George listened quietly. Then he replied, "I'll play whatever you want me to play," or "I won't play at all." It wasn't an angry outburst. It was calm, almost resigned. For many fans, those few words revealed years of frustration more clearly than any shouting match ever could. Only days later, George temporarily walked out of the band. However, this is where many online stories become exaggerated. Some videos claim George truly hated Paul more than anyone else. The evidence doesn't support that conclusion. George openly criticized Paul at times, especially during the final Beatles years. He felt Paul could be controlling in the studio and believed his own songs weren't always given the attention they deserved. But relationships are rarely that simple. After the Beatles broke up in 1970, there were periods when George and Paul remained distant. They exchanged criticism in interviews and occasionally through their music. Yet there were also moments of reconciliation. Over the years, they spoke again, worked through some of their differences, and expressed mutual respect for each other's extraordinary talent. George himself acknowledged that their disagreements were often intensified by the enormous pressure surrounding the world's biggest band. The reality was not a story of permanent hatred. It was a story of two gifted musicians with different personalities, different working styles, and different visions of what their music could become. Everyone faces moments when they feel overlooked or misunderstood. Maybe you experienced that at work, at school, or even within your own family. George's story reminds us that even the most successful people struggle to be heard, and that honest communication can be one of life's greatest challenges. The world loved the music the Beatles created together, but behind every legendary song were four human beings, each carrying hopes, frustrations, and dreams of their own. And before long, those differences would help bring the greatest band in history to an unforgettable end. By the beginning of 1970, it had become clear that the Beatles were no longer the band they had once been. The laughter that filled recording studios in the early years had been replaced by business meetings, legal disagreements, and creative conflicts. The magic was still there, but so was the strain. George Harrison had grown tremendously as a songwriter. During the final years of the Beatles, he wrote songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun, both of which became classics. Many critics and fans believed he was finally receiving the recognition he had deserved for years. Ironically, it happened just as the band was falling apart. The breakup wasn't caused by one person. It was a result of many pressures coming together. The death of manager Brian Epstein in 1967 left the group without its trusted guide. Business disagreements became more serious. Each Beatle was developing different musical interests, and their personal lives were changing as well. George wanted more creative freedom. John Lennon was increasingly focused on his own artistic path and life with Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney wanted to keep the band productive and organized. Ringo Starr often found himself trying to keep the peace. Eventually, those different visions could no longer fit inside one band. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, fans around the world were heartbroken. Newspapers treated it as the end of an era. Many hoped the four musicians would reunite one day, but life moved in a different direction. For George, the breakup became an opportunity rather than an ending. Only months later, he released All Things Must Pass, a triple album filled with songs he had been unable to record with the Beatles. It was a huge critical and commercial success, proving that George had always possessed a remarkable songwriting voice. Songs like My Sweet Lord, What Is Life, and Isn't It a Pity reached millions of listeners and showed the world that he was far more than the quiet Beatle. His success sent a powerful message. Sometimes, people simply need the space to become who they were always capable of being. Years later, George also organized a concert for Bangladesh in 1971, one of the first major benefit concerts in rock history. The event raised global awareness and humanitarian aid for people suffering during the Bangladesh refugee crisis, showing that George wanted his music to make a difference beyond entertainment. Maybe that's why so many people admired him. Fame was never his final goal. He wanted purpose. He wanted peace. He wanted music that meant something. If you've enjoyed discovering the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, subscribe now. The final chapter reveals how George looked back on these difficult years, how his relationship with Paul changed over time, and why the truth is far more inspiring than the rumors. The Beatles were gone, but George Harrison's journey was far from over. In many ways, the most meaningful chapter of his life had only just begun. Time has a way of changing people. The anger that once feels overwhelming can slowly give way to understanding. For George Harrison, the years after the Beatles were not just about building a solo career. They were also about finding peace. Many fans expected the former Beatles to remain enemies forever. That never truly happened. Yes, George and Paul McCartney had real disagreements. They challenged each other in the studio, held different creative visions, and occasionally spoke critically about one another in interviews. Those conflicts were genuine, but the idea that George truly hated Paul more than anyone else is an exaggeration that isn't supported by the historical record. As the years passed, their relationship softened. They met on different occasions, spoke respectfully about each other's talents, and shared memories of the extraordinary journey they had experienced together. They never returned to close friendship of their teenage years, but neither did they remain locked in endless bitterness. George himself often reflected on life through the lens of spirituality. He believed that holding on to anger only created more suffering. That philosophy became increasingly important after he survived a terrifying home invasion in 1999, when an intruder broke into his home and seriously injured him. The attack could have left him consumed by fear or hatred. Instead, George continued to focus on family, music, and inner peace. His final years were quieter than the Beatlemania days, but they reflected the values he had spent decades searching for. On November 29th, 2001, George Harrison passed away after battling cancer. He was 58 years old. Tributes came from around the world. Paul McCartney remembered him as a lovely guy and one of the greatest musicians he had ever known. Ringo Starr honored his lifelong friend. Fans celebrated not only George's incredible songs, but also his kindness, humility, and spiritual outlook. In the end, that is the real legacy of George Harrison, not the rumors, not the dramatic headlines, not the claims that he hated someone more than anyone else. His real story is far more powerful. It is the story of a quiet young guitarist who refused to stop growing, a songwriter who waited patiently for his voice to be heard, a man who found global fame but spent his life searching for something even greater, meaning. Maybe you've had disagreements with someone who once meant a great deal to you. George Harrison's journey reminds us that relationships are rarely black and white. People argue, drift apart, and sometimes reconnect with a deeper understanding. Growth doesn't erase the past, but it can change how we carry it. The Beatles changed music forever. George Harrison changed the way many people thought about creativity, spirituality, and personal growth. His songs continue to inspire millions because they came from a place of honesty. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The loudest voices are not always the strongest. Sometimes the quietest person leaves the deepest impact. Thank you for watching. But George Harrison isn't the only music legend whose greatest struggles happen behind closed doors. In our next documentary, we'll uncover another unforgettable story that reveals how fame can hide conflicts the world never sees.